Backpacking in the Alabama Wilderness by CMVR 2256. I had to recite this story and let you guys know what happened. My brother had to help me recount this as I was 12 at the time. So this happened about 6 years ago. As I stated before, I was about 12 and my brother was 26 at the time. My brother had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened, and he was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment if I remember correctly. Also as a note, he was a Green Beret and had recently completed the Army Special Forces qualification, and by that was an active duty SF Engineer Sergeant. Definitely somebody you wouldn't want to mess around with. Given that we'd both grown up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip to northern Alabama. And he was going to have to be leaving for 9 months, so he thought this was a really nice thing for us to do together. So, that is just what we did. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night when we were camping. At around 8 PM we had got our camp set up, eaten dinner and were sitting by the fire talking about typical boy stuff. For some reference, our spot was about 50 yards away from a large stream and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream and the path formed a triangle of sorts, if that makes sense. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys who looked like they were in their late 20s wandered up to ask us if we had seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some further into the wilderness and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite, I got a seriously creepy vibe from them dirty clothes they were wearing, their greasy hair, scraggly facial hair, etc. I think they looked like something out of a movie, to be honest. They then kind of hung around for way longer than they should have probably, asking us all kinds of weird questions and looking around. They asked us how long we'd been here, how long we were planning to stay, and it kind of looked like they were sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I don't know for sure, but my brother didn't. But I still felt very uneasy about the whole thing. Now fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke up to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, but it sounded like they were about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked him if he was awake or if he had heard the dogs. He responded, "Yeah, I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, the 12-year-old me was absolutely terrified. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither of them come any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down, then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow I managed to fall back to sleep, however. The fact that they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just saying what he did to try and keep me calm. Fast forward a few hours, which was probably another 3 or so at around 2 AM. I had managed to sleep pretty well after hearing the hog hunters, when I then woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on, follow me quick. Be as quiet as you can, okay?" My heart then immediately went straight back to racing. I heard the dogs and voices in the distance again, but they were further away than before, but still just as distinct. Without asking any questions, my brother then told me that I had to climb onto his back so we could get away quicker, and like that, we very slowly and carefully unzipped the tent, and very quietly made our way out. We weren't sure where they were, but we snuck about 50 yards into the woods towards the junction of the path and the stream and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remembered as we were laying down how loudly I was breathing and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol side racking. I then looked over at my brother and he had his pistol out. I was watching the campsite and surrounding area, and then I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our campsite, and by this time, 30 or so minutes later, they had actually reached it. There were 5 of them, and like 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, and all of them either had a rifle or shotgun on them. Their dogs were going absolutely crazy, obviously having smelt us. For those of you who are backpackers/campers, nobody comes up on a random campsite in the middle of the night with dogs and guns who has good intentions. Obviously. I knew this, and my brother knew it as well. I was terrified. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me that they were talking about us, although he hadn't heard any specifics. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves, when my brother then put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards us, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop or look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashlights." I didn't know what he meant by this, but that will come later, I promise. I knew I could make it back because he taught me the land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He later told me that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down the amount of ambient light, making it harder for other people to see you from a distance. Now at this point, I was practically crying, but at the same time, I had this rush of adrenaline, and maybe it was confidence, but I thought I could handle myself. Now we laid there for a long time, when suddenly out of nowhere come the screaming, "Where you at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother then dragged me behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill was protected from any gunfire. While waiting up there terrified, thinking maybe we were about to die, they shot maybe 5 or 6 more times. It was a truly terrifying moment to be up there like that. It's a very primitive fear that you feel in these situations. They then started walking maybe 100 yards away. I was so scared they were going to spot us up there, and it seemed like they were going towards our position when I suddenly heard a blaring siren and saw emergency services flashing through the woods. It turns out that my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone. This is one that my family had given him for emergencies. It had turned out that my brother had actually called them while I was asleep. Now the wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get here on the dirt roads. When my brother saw the warden truck, he signalled them with the light and pointed them in the directions the hunters had gone. The guy then sped off, shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp. We packed up all of our stuff and waited by the path for the warden to come back. He then gave us a ride in the bed of his truck back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother had told me how brave I had been and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. But I told him not to because I thought they would never let me camp out again. Woods of Northern Wisconsin by Windy City 13. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend and I were camping in Chequamegon National Forest in northern Wisconsin, and after our experience, we don't plan on returning unless we go with a very large group of people. My girlfriend and I are from Chicago, so northern Wisconsin was our go-to place for rest and relaxation. We've done a number of hiking trips to northern Wisconsin and in the up, but never to this area. Now, by no means are we backpacking experts, but we've been to a number of national parks and have been hiking out and exploring for some time, really whenever we can get away from work. We love getting away from people and relaxing in nature, but this trip made us appreciate the presence of other people around us in unfamiliar places. Our plan was to hike a remote section of North Country Trail. The North Country Trail is a national scenic trail like the Appalachian Trail, but this gets used much less. In some parts of the northern Wisconsin trails, they can be very remote. They're only accessible via logging roads, so we had to plan to hike about 15 miles along the trail to a backpack shelter. Then we would have to spend the night and hike back to the car the following day, so it wasn't necessarily straightforward. We spent the night at a friend's house in Warsaw, and we set out early the next day to the trailhead. As we entered the national forest boundary, we were captivated by the beauty of the thick green forests. I drove slowly through the login road so that way we could take it in as we made our way to our car parking spot. While we were driving down the trailhead, we passed a couple of people standing next to a parked truck on the other side of the road. They appeared to be hillbillies, as they had a rusted out burgundy pickup truck, complete with Confederate bumper stickers. As we drove past, I waved to them, and they just stared back without returning any greeting to us. Friendly people, I thought to myself as we passed them. It was when I looked back into the rearview mirror that I noticed they were still staring at us. Before we got to the bend, I glanced in my mirror again and saw that they were watching us through the haze of road dust. My girlfriend and I joked about the up north people, but we did not think anything of the encounter, to be honest. Aside from those people, we didn't encounter anyone else on the remote logging roads within the national forest boundary. We found the trailhead about 15 minutes later though, after finding our way onto the narrow logging road. There was no one else parked at the trailhead. A perfect chance to get some solitude, fresh air and relaxation. After parking, we made sure that the car was locked and we hoisted our packs and set off onto the trail. The weather was relatively cool, which thankfully kept the mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. We marvelled at the beauty of where we were, taking photos of the forest and the surrounding area that was just so beautiful. After a solid 8 hours of hiking, we found our campsite. It consisted of a wooden backpack shelter and a fire ring. Even though the shelter provided an ample space for us, we opted to set up our tent in a small clearing about 100 feet behind the shelter. We built a fire at the shelter ring and boiled the water for our dehydrated trail food. As we ate, we passed around some wine and just marvelled at how beautiful the stars were that you could see, saying how you could hardly see them while you're in the city. After the fire eventually burnt out, we decided to go back to our tent. We settled into our tent and looked through the pictures that we took that day. But after lugging a heavy backpack for 15 miles and drinking some wine, I was ready for some shut-eye. When we camped at the state national parks, I usually wore earplugs, but that night, There were no RVs or any other campers to make noise, so I just closed my eyes and let the noise of the forest lull me to sleep. My girlfriend was very uneasy that night, but she normally had some apprehension whenever we were sleeping away from home. I'm not sure when we drifted to sleep, but we awoken to a bone-chilling noise. It was pitch black outside, and over the insects in the forest, I heard a dull thud. It sounded like somebody was hitting two logs together. My girlfriend and I were wide awake at this point and still laying silent in our tent trying to hear the noise. Our old tent had a mesh window, but the backpacking tent we were using had no windows. We could only guess what was making the noises outside of our tent at that point. We initially thought that maybe an animal had gone into our garbage and started eating our food, but this sound was too much different. It didn't sound like the rustling that food wrappers would make, or any of our camp equipment for that matter. Our hearts were pounding as we heard the noise persist to knock in the darkness. Unarmed, we just laid there terrified, not really knowing what to do. There wasn't much we could do. I would have normally carried a can of bear spray, but I decided to leave it at home to save some weight. Much against the wishes of my girlfriend, I must say. The knocking then continued, but we remained still as to not give away our location. For all we knew, whatever was making the noises had already spotted our tent. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking ceased. We laid in complete silence with only the dull buzz of the insects in the background. Then we heard it. Leaves rustling, a branch breaking, then voices. We heard low talking in the distance. We could not make out what was being said, but it sounded like a couple of people talking away from us. The voices continued for a bit, but to our relief, the voices did not seem to be getting any louder. Whoever it was didn't spot us or our tent, or maybe decided to leave us alone. We sat there in our tent for the rest of the night, adrenaline surging through our veins. At the first sight of light, we decided to emerge from our tent. I looked around in all directions to see if anybody was out there, but I only saw the forest and the backpack shelter. We quickly rolled up our sleeping bags and camp stuff and quickly put our tents away. When we got to the shelter, my girlfriend screamed in horror. On the entrance to the shelter, the wood was freshly cut. The word "kill" was put into the shelter wall, and there was a number of axe/knife cuts where somebody was chopping at the wall. I then looked at the ground and I could see that there was a fresh scattering of wood splinters. After grabbing our food supply and garbage bag, we got the hell out of there. We were nearly jogging with all our gear as we made our way back to my car. I kept glancing back over my shoulder and gazing through the woods to see if anybody was following us. We traversed the glacial eskers that we saw the day before, and we knew that we were getting close to my car. We were quietly rejoicing as we neared the entrance of the trailhead. We made it back in near record time, but something was wrong. The windshield wiper on my car was sticking straight up, and there had been something stuck to the wiper. As we inched closer to the car, I saw there was blood smeared on the windshield and a squirrel carcass that was impaled onto the blade. Hair and blood stuck to the wiper on the hood of my car. I didn't bother cleaning it off though. We threw our gear into the truck and I sped off without even removing the animal from the wiper blade. I sped down the gravel logging road and I kept glancing in my rear view. I couldn't see anything though but a cloud of dust behind us. We then got to a gas station by the nearest town. I removed the carcass with a wad of newspaper and tried to remove as much blood as I could. I filled up on gas and we didn't stop until we made it back. This was the last trip I ever took to Wisconsin. The Smiling Stranger on the Ridge by T. Fires. I grew up in a small coal town in the Appalachian Mountains. On one side of the mountains are actually borders with the valley of the town. It was a wonderful place for outdoorsy kids. We had no immediate neighbours and acres of woods to play in. Above our house there was a ridge that ran along the border of a skate park, but all the trails and public areas were far in the valley below, separated by a thick forest and plenty of no trespassing signs, so we were very rarely going to encounter any hikers crossing into our land. From our house, there was a dirt road that wound up the mountainside to the top of the ridge, where that stood the remains of a burnt down cabin. From there, you could follow the ridge to a flat area popular with my dad's hunting friends, one of whom posted a trail cam during the off-season to monitor the wildlife activity such as coyotes, occasional bears and mountain lions. From there, you could continue up the ridge to a clearing that hosts a lot of flat boulders and a giant electrical tower that was fun to climb on. Probably not the best idea to do, but we did so anyway. I'd venture up there often with the family's black lab and spend hours reading, climbing and generally enjoying the nature. One full day when I was around 13, I headed up there with a backpack full of snacks and a book. I'd taken special care not to set off the trail cam too, since I'd gotten into trouble inadvertently for filming entire rolls of film just of me goofing around in the area where it was posted. I eventually reached my favourite rock near the edge of the clearing towards the power lines, and I'd just settled down to begin reading when Felicia started to bark and growl aggressively. At first I paid no mind as she loved to chase deer, but this time she didn't bound off into the woods. She just stayed next to me, continually growling at something unseen in the distance. Now, I'd considered hiking down that way into the park on occasions before, but it wasn't an easy passage. The area had been cleared years before to install the electrical towers, and in its place had grown a thick mass of bulbs and weeds. The rocks that were there made great climbing though, but the top of the ridge became difficult because how steep it got. Not to mention that there was much easier ways to cross closer to the park entrance. This way brought you down to an undeveloped area that was at the very back of the camping grounds that wasn't easily accessible to cars or hikers, so I was taken off guard when I saw that there was a man fighting his way through the bushes from that direction. Nervously, I called out, "Hello," and gripped on Felicia's collar. She had a tendency to jump on people when she got excited, and I didn't want her to tumble him down the mountain. I'd overheard my parents arguing about lawsuits when she'd actually gone into a jogger who fell over. The man then smiled, extracted himself from the thorns and made his way up the hill to the base of my rock. I don't know if it was Felicia's reaction to him growling, or rather the remote and impassable way that he had come from, but his presence had made me feel really uneasy. Now, to be fair, he seemed nice enough at first. He was probably in his mid to late 20s, he was average height and built. He was rather unremarkable looking, to be honest. He didn't have any backpack or supplies, but he was dressed as a hiker would be. I didn't like the way he looked at me. Although at my young age I couldn't place why it unsettled me, as a grown woman I can look back and realise he was sizing me up. From the way he smiled, he seemed to be pleased with what he saw. "Hi, where do you come from?" he said to me. He had no trace of an accent. This struck me as really odd. Our area has a pretty strong regional accent and we don't really get any outsiders. "I live just down the hill. I was hiking with my dog." "She seems nice," he told me. He had no trace of irony. Felicia was snarling and vibrating with menace, but he seemed unconcerned. "God, you should put her on a leash though. You don't want to get into trouble here." We put her on a leash when we're down in the park, but this is our property." He had no reaction to the fact that I had just told him he was trespassing on our property. "Still, you're so close. You don't know who you might run up into these places." "No one from the park comes up here," I said to him. I was being a bit rude, but I was annoyed that some stranger was telling me what to do with my dog on my property. "I'm from the park," he said to me and grinned. "I'm one of the rangers and I wanted to see the property. What would you have done if she had attacked me? You would have got in big trouble." At this, I immediately shuddered at this because there was only one ranger for our area and he was actually a good friend of our family. This was definitely not him. Though I was afraid to let on to the fact that I knew he was lying. So I dug out Felicia's leash and clipped her on, then stood up and put my backpack on. "Sorry, we'll let you get on with your hike. I gotta get home." "Your parents know that you're up here?" "Oh, yeah, they expect me home soon." "Huh, do they come up here often?" "Yeah, my dad does. He comes up here to check the trail cams pretty often, to be honest." "Trail cams?" "Yeah, there's a lot up here. Him and his friends like to hunt." The smile then returned, but this time it was cold. "Well, these would make excellent hunting grounds." He took steps towards me and Felicia lunged at him, nearly yanking the leash out of my hands, but I managed to pull her back in time, only just managing to stop her tearing his head off. He didn't even flinch. "You should head back. Keep a tight hold on that leash now. Maybe I'll see you up here again sometime," he said with a smile. "Yeah, maybe," I said, secretly thinking to myself that I'd never step foot into the woods again. "But bye," I said. I quickly grabbed Felicia back and, looking over my shoulder every now and then, began jogging back home. He remained motionless in the spot where I'd left him, staring straight back at me with some crazy menacing smile. Once he was out of sight, I picked up the pace and Felicia growled over her shoulder a few times occasionally as I heard branches snap behind me, but glancing back, I didn't see anyone. I cut straight across a clearing with the trail cam not bothering to avoid it in my rush to get away from the stranger. Once we hit the road that led home, I unclipped the dog from her leash and broke into another jog. She remained by my side until I got home. Now, I didn't mention the stranger to my parents at first. They were very wary about me hiking alone and I didn't want to tell them about it. Furthermore, by the time I got him back, I convinced myself that I'd been overreacting to the whole thing. He was probably just a hiker who had made up the bit about being a ranger just to annoy me since I was giving him attitude. Still, I didn't hike back up to that ridge that week and instead I stuck to the woods behind my house. At the end of the week, I come home from school to an annoyed dad, demanding to know if I'd messed with the trail cam. His buddy had come up to collect some film and discovered that the cam had been switched off with only a few frames taken. At first, I was only concerned with getting in trouble and desperately professed that I was innocent. And, Then I remembered the stranger. After telling my dad about him, he called the park ranger to ask if there was a new ranger we didn't know about. The ranger said no. Thinking back on it to this day, I would hate to think what would have happened had I not actually told the guy about the trail cams. I really don't like to bring myself to think about it. Strange Mountain Man by Phil Coleman. I had this experience a few weeks earlier but decided to share it now while it was still fresh in my mind. St. Patrick's Day is a crazy occasion for most cities, and my hometown of Dublin is no exception. Last week I found myself with a few days off on either side of our national holiday, so I decided to get away from the madness of the city and spend some time camping and hiking in the nearby mountains. On the eve of my trip, my buddy called me to tell me that he was sick and wouldn't be joining me on my adventure. Who needs him? I thought, and decided to make the trip alone. The weather turned out to be absolutely beautiful, and I spent a very enjoyable St. Patrick's Day hiking through the woods and mountains above Dublin, alongside a good number of similar-minded folks. At around roughly 4 PM, I spotted a nice thick set of trees in the distance and made my way towards what seemed like an absolutely perfect campsite. I even found a clearing, and I set up my shelter and prepared for my delicious dinner before settling down with a book and the sounds of the wilderness for company. It was wonderful. However, at 7 PM, something changed. I suddenly become very uncomfortable and agitated. There was somebody nearby. I just knew it. It was completely dark, and I scanned the surrounding woods with my torch, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. It was just me and the trees. Settle down. It's just the sounds of nature. Of course you're going to be scared alone in the woods, I said to myself. But no matter how much I tried to clear my mind, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that something just wasn't right about the situation I was in. I knew that the last bus left the nearest city at about 10:30 PM, and that was roughly 3 hours away by foot. In the heat of the moment, I decided to get out of there and take my chances on the trail. I packed my stuff in record time then and started getting out of there, but I was stumbling over fallen trees and whatnot until I hit the trail. I was in a panic but comfortable by the well-trodden path. I now knew that I would only have to travel for about another half an hour before I'd reach the paved road, and from that it was only an hour before I led to the village. However, after only a few hundred meters, I was stopped in my tracks. Sitting on a tree stump that was just off to the side of the trail sat a lone figure. By the light of my headlamp, I saw that it was a man dressed in dark street clothing, rather than the bright hiking gear one might expect him to be in. I was instantly on edge. There was literally no point trying to hide at this point because there was no doubt that he had already seen my headlamp and reflective jacket. We drew closer in the darkness, and I saw that he was roughly in his 30s. As I passed, he looked at me and smiled and said, "Lovely evening." "Yeah, it is." I said something like that in more of a mumble. I continued forward on my guard. After a minute or two, I turned to look behind me and I saw no sight of the guy. There was a house a kilometer or so in the distance, but I thought it would be best that I would just go and stop and ask for directions at the village road. Several minutes later, I felt again a sense of uneasiness and checked back on the path behind me. only to see that figure once again. I knew that I was in real danger this time. He was heading in the exact same direction as me into the darkness. I began hurrying towards a house. I didn't bother looking back, and I eventually began to reach the warm glow of the cottage. Checking over my shoulder, I got directions from a nice elderly couple. I was then pleased to learn that the road was just a small distance away at the bottom of their driveway. With no sign of the mountain man behind me, I walked on. Just as I reached the road, I heard a banging noise from the direction of the house, followed by an outlay of breath yet a familiar voice. I've been separated from my friend. Did he come this way? Without thinking, I scrambled up to the embankment at the side of the road and concealed myself the best I could. I had my camping knife in one hand. My heart was beating so fast, I couldn't even hear the householder's reply. All I heard was the sound of the door closing, followed by footsteps onto the gravel driveway. I then saw the silhouette of the man in the moonlight. He walked into the road and peered into the distance in either direction, before hurrying off in the opposite direction of the village. I could tell he was hunting me now. I waited in the hedge for, I suppose, 15 or 20 minutes, absolutely terrified. I eventually plucked up the courage to continue to walk towards civilization. I was still extremely paranoid, but I had to go on for over an hour before I heard the rumble of a car engine in the distance, and I then saw its headlights approaching. I stuck my thumb up, and to my surprise the driver actually stopped. I asked if he could give me a ride into the village, and he said no problem. Once in the car, the driver, who was a nice friendly Polish man, asked if I was looking for my friend. Friend? No, I'm just out here hiking alone. I just lost track of time. I lied because I didn't want to start scaring myself. Oh, I only asked because I had just got flagged down by another young man who told me he was looking for his friend, and you match his description perfectly. He seemed very agitated. In shock, I told the driver about my encounter with the mountain man, and how that he had headed into the opposite direction over an hour ago in search of me. Well, he must have turned around or something, because he stopped me only a few hundred meters behind the spot where I picked you up from. 5 minutes later, I was back in the well-lit, well-populated village that I wanted to be in. I made it in good time for the bus, and within an hour I was back in Dublin. I have no idea what was up with that man or what he wanted. I'm just thankful that I trusted my gut and my instinct. In the Hills, No One Can Hear You Cry by Smitface. This is actually my stepmom / her best friend's story. I have my own, but I'm so hesitant to drag up some of the things that happened to me. I'm just hoping by telling someone else's, it'll help me open up a little more. Now, my stepmom didn't like us much, but she told my sister, who was 3 years older than me, and I, this strange encounter that she had growing up that scared us stupidly. It was my family's version of the stranger danger story. My stepmom, we'll just call her Nancy, grew up as a kind of privileged teen in the 70s, and her family had moved to America from England when she was about 9. She went to a pretty nice high school in a really nice town. There she made friends with a girl called Lily. She didn't exactly run with Nancy's type of crowd, to be honest, but they really hit it off, and Lily would take Nancy out to do her type of stuff, like hiking, fishing, sailing. Anyway, because of Lily's influence, the two of them would do a lot of stuff and spend a lot of time together. So one Sunday they decide to go hike in some hills about an hour away. Mancy put on what I'm sure were extremely expensive hiking shoes, and the two of them drove off to the hiking trails. Lily parked in some big clearing with makeshift parking spots, like a pile of woods marking the edge of each space. But there were no other cars there. This is the only important thing in hindsight. They actually begun hiking up the hill off of the trail because Lily thought that she was kind of bad and wanted to do so. Now the hike was nothing extraordinary. If you asked my stepmom, she would just say it was maybe 15 minutes and it was a little bit rough but easy to do. Anyway, they eventually reached the top of the hill and my stepmom was done. The polished pampered side of her was coming out and she groaned until Lily reluctantly said alright. They were going to rest and then walk the rest of the way down slower. Now they'd only been heading down that hill for maybe 10 minutes when Mancy then started moaning again. Lily kept on walking down the side of the road instead of to the rough hiking trail. So there they are, probably looking like a couple of tools geared up for hiking and walking down a really dodgy road. And not even 5 minutes into their descent, a really dodgy looking truck pulled up right next to them. It was very rusty and red. It generally just looked like a clunker. The guy driving rolled down the window and the girls looked in through the passenger side window at him. He had a big beard, a baseball cap pulled down and long brown hair. He greeted them and even smiled through his beard, asking them if they needed a ride. Mancy described him as charming and even cute. Lily still says the moment that he greeted them back sent shivers up her spine. Despite her better judgment, my stepmom convinced her to get in the truck. The two girls then opened the passenger side door to this rusty old thing. The guy directed them behind the seat to get into the back. They settled into his truck and started rumbling forwards. Lily always said at this point it hit her what a massive mistake they had just made. The backseat was clean enough, but there was a rope on the floor behind the driver's seat, as well as 4 boxes of wrap half hanging out from under the passenger seat. This seemed more than weird enough, but Lily didn't want to freak out my stepmom, so she just kept quiet. After about 10 minutes, the woods didn't look any clearer, and they hadn't seen another car for the entirety of the journey. Lily asked how long he thought it would be. He said he was taking a different route down the hill and had to stop somewhere else to get something first. That was it. The girls were only 16 or 17 at the time and Lily didn't want to press the issue. She was scared. Now she could remember what he looked like. This was because she was sitting behind him. He looked like a woodsy guy, but his hair was super tangled and dirty. She noticed custard mud on his collar and tried to find something indefinable about him, but got scared the more she picked up on little details. He was youngish, strong looking, and he had a 1 on both of them. So they didn't ask any more questions and didn't want to offer any more information as they drove on. Several minutes after that, they reached a tiny shack/log cabin that was placed right in the clearing of the trees. There was an old stump where somebody had been chopping wood and a huge axe stuck in the log. Lily was definitely on red alert now. The guy then turned off the truck and slipped out of it saying, "I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere," and he then disappeared into the house. Lily tried to talk to my stepmom about how incredibly uncomfortable she was, but she mostly just dismissed it at this point, easing into it. Lily then literally started begging and increasingly freaking out and finally put her foot down, demanding that Mancy exited the truck with her, so they got out and walked around the vehicle. The house was about 50 yards in front of them. Why this guy would have left 2 young girls in the truck alone while he went into the house is beyond me, and they just wandered around, looking at it hesitantly. If this guy was really decent and was just trying to give them a ride, it would be super rude to just run off like that, right? My stepmom had this strict upbringing when it come to manners and public persona, and she saw it as an issue of that nature. So she then actually went back towards the truck, opened the door and got right behind the passenger seat. She must have been crazy. Lily was really angry and followed her to yell at her some more. As they both got back to the truck, they found that there was a half-hidden big hatchet that was under a seat. It had dried blood stains covering the blade and stuck to the floor under it. Lily understandably lost it upon seeing it, and my stepmom started getting hysterical. They decided that leaving was by far their best option at this point, and they just booked it out to the side of the property into the trees. They fumbled around in the trees for a little while until Lily was fairly confident that they were back on their way down the hill. My stepmom cried all of the way down. Lily felt bad about it, but was also completely freaked out that he would hear it and keep trying to come after them. When they finally got back down to the bottom and saw the old wooden fence that surrounded the original parking area, they were massively relieved. But as they got closer, they saw it. The truck. It was parked on the other side of the gravelly makeshift lot, just sitting there, facing the other way innocently. Now, they couldn't see if anybody was in it, and of course Mancy didn't want to run to the car, but Lily was super hesitant. She managed to calm my stepmom down, saying she wanted to wait before running to try and open it to see if there was anybody there. Now remember, this was the 70s, so there were no cell phones, there was no ranger station or anybody around. The parking lot was big and empty. Who knows what could have happened to them if they simply decided to walk up to it. Thankfully, Lily convinced my stepmom to chill and the two of them hunkered down against a big tree. They were then hidden by bushes and other trees. They laid there and waited it out for what seemed to be like a couple of hours until dark eventually fell. All of the animals come out and started making noises, and predictably, my stepmom started getting angsty about this and bothered Lily again, who was obviously tired and moments away from giving in. She was just able to plan their dash to the car when they heard a clunk. Across the twilight lit car park, they saw one of the back doors to the car swing open. The bearded guy slid his way out of the back seat. He got out, shut the door, looked around the surrounding forest for several moments. He then just got back to his truck, lumbered past their car and out of sight. Several minutes after watching him drive away, they sprinted to their car as fast as they possibly could, jumped in and booked it out of there. That was the last that they ever saw of him.